Everyone. This is Katie McCarville, and today I am going to be telling you about the facilitation that Laura Campen and I put together. We were focusing on Howard's first chapter called White Man Dancing, A Story of Personal Transformation. And this chapter was really about his own personal journey of his racial identity and also coming to terms with other people's racial identity. So the first part of his chapter is talking about the luxury of innocence. He starts out by explaining that as he was growing up, he was in a period of cultural encapsulation, which means that he was really only surrounded by his culture and he didn't have much exposure to cultures or races that were different than his own. When he was in high school, he was presented with the opportunity to go on a double date with a black woman, and he described his reaction to this opportunity as being unsure and being scared. And he wrote that fear is the classic white American reaction to any intrusion into our cultural capsule. So, what he learned from this experience after going on the double date with this African American woman is that they really weren't so different after all. So, he took away from the experience that we have to recognize our differences and similarities and then determine how we are going to react. We can either deepen our awareness and continue to grow, or we can shrink back into the safety of isolation. And this picture just shows where your comfort zone is and where the magic happens, just really showing that he had to step out of his comfort zone to even realize um, that although he and this woman were different, they had even more in common. So next, Howard talked about his baptism by fire. So when he went to college, he moved from Seattle to Yale, and he had the opportunity to work at the YMCA with Hispanic and Black kids. And this was his first opportunity to really learn about racial inequality and poverty. And one of the big takeaways that he had was that he realized that these were good people. These families cared, they wanted the best for their kids. And this was just something that he had never been exposed to before. So he spent a lot of time working in what was called the Hill, which was sort of the low socioeconomic area. There were a lot of families who were living in poverty, and he actually ended up, after working with these families in this particular area, he and his wife moved into the Hill during the Civil Rights Movement. So he really was living with the people that he had previously been working with, but because there was a lot of unrest at this time, he experienced riots and burnings in his neighborhood, and all of this caused his perspective to shift. His ideas about politics, religion, and even reality were completely changed. They had been transformed from what they had been when he was living in Seattle, and he was living sort of a very sheltered life with people who were racially similar to himself, and his world really was turned upside down. So Howard found that he was very welcomed into this diverse community at the Hill. His neighbors, though they were racially different, socioeconomically different than him, they embraced him and they wanted him to learn about their culture. So he worked as the only white staff member at a summer camp for any inner city high school kids, and he was actually hired to help work on Black identity so that the students who were going to the camp could learn more about race issues, and then he could also learn more about race issues as well. He had to confront the white supremacy and implicity that he felt he was having with the race issues at the time. And during that summer, the arrival of the Black Panthers really had a great impact on him. He saw the hope and the energy that they brought for change, but it also forced him to realize the power and willingness of white America to maintain its own dominance. So I thought this quote was really important. It says it was only through living with people outside my particular fishbowl that I was able to finally perceive the true nature of my previously invisible milieu. So I just thought that was very interesting that he had to actually go way out of his comfort zone and way out of his fishbowl and learn from others so that he could really gain perspective. All right. So in 1969, after receiving feedback from the Black Panthers, it allowed him to realize the real work needed to happen in his own white community. He really needed to take it home. So he had rejected his racial identity. He did not want to be seen as a white middle class male because he realized that it implied complicity, privilege, and racism. So he felt like now it was his duty to go back and inform other white people about their complicity, privilege, and racism. So, he was really amped up. He felt very strongly and passionately about these issues. So he first went and worked in the church. And after a lot of reflection after this time in his life, he realized that his approach was very harsh. He would see people and he would approach them and say things like, what you need to know is you're a racist and this is a problem and you have to change. And people did not respond well to that. So over time, he ended up taking a break and leaving his work in the church, and he did some self-reflection, and he realized that what he needed to do was engage positively with these people, and he decided to do that through education. So what he did was he shared the importance of multicultural education for all through writing papers and actually developing curriculums, and this became a prototype for the Reach Center. And one of the things that he shared about this experience was that he truly relied on a diverse support system and that he could not have accomplished these positive engagement and positive outreach approaches by himself. He depended on his racially different friends and support system to help him through this. And one of the quotes in the article was white identity development is intrinsically tied to direct engagement across the cultural and racial divide. So to truly understand who he was as a white male, he needed to be engaged with people who were racially different than himself. So next he spoke about shaping an authentic white identity. And many people feel ashamed and want to rip away their racial identity when they really learn about white history and how we have suppressed people who were of different ethnicities or different racial backgrounds. And he realized that his sense of identity had been created really from learning and experiencing other cultures. The time that he had spent at the Hill, the time that he had spent working at the YMCA. And he realized that this had really formed his identity. And his identity up to this point had been trying to get away from who he was as a white person. And he realized that he was missing a piece of his own identity as a white male. So he decided that although he had to come to terms with these horrible atrocities that white people had committed over the years, there was also a positive to his white identity. So he knew that he needed to understand his own culture as a white person. And he said that finding a deep connection with personal culture that is indigenous to his own heritage really is what helped him. It created a circle of meaning, context, and relationship to all of life. And he found that by looking into his past, into his ancestors, he was able to sort of find that missing piece of who he was. So the dance continues. It's important to recognize our own privilege, complicity, and ignorance, and we can learn from Howard's experience that we really have to go deeper into our understanding of ourselves, but also acknowledge the realities that are different from our own. So we have 3 discussion questions for you to consider and think about. The first is about cultural encapsulation. It's defined as the lack of understanding or ignorance of another's cultural background and the influence this background has on one's current view of the world. So our question to you is, how can we as educators help ensure our students break free from this cultural encapsulation? The second question is, have you ever felt that you wanted to rip away your racial identity? Explain why this was or why you haven't felt that way. And then the last question is, have you ever learned something new about a culture by spending time with someone who is racially different from you? Or have you learned something more about your own culture by looking through the perspective of someone who is racially different than you? And then please explain that experience. And then here are our references. Thanks.